Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a really high-stakes issue. Our source material frames it as something threatening the legal foundations of an entire continent.
That's right. We're diving into the Horn of Africa, specifically looking at Ethiopia's recent, very public statements about needing sea access and critically claims involving Eritrean territory.
And our main source for this deep dive, it's important to note, is a very strong editorial analysis. It's from ETN News24's diplomatic series. Just so you know, this isn't like a neutral news report.
No, definitely not. It's presenting a forceful argument, really a legal and moral condemnation.
Okay, so our mission today for you listening is to really unpack what this source is arguing, because it doesn't see this as just, political noise.
Not at all. The editorial claims Ethiopia's rhetoric, its stated ambition to claim sovereign Eritrean land, amounts to actual state-sponsored expansionism.
And it's calling for a response.
An urgent one, yeah. From the international community, legally, diplomatically, morally, it sees this as a fundamental challenge.
Wow. So the source frames it as a crisis of law, really, not just politics. And it demands a full reckoning for what it calls, and this is a direct quote, a direct assault on the very foundation of the post-colonial African order. Heavy stuff.
It is. And what's striking is how specific it gets.
Yeah.
The analysis looks right at the ruling Prosperity Party's rhetoric, the media campaign that seems orchestrated around it.
Okay.
And this openly stated goal of getting Red Sea access, maybe even through, pressure or force against Eritrea, it's focused on that declared intent.
Right. Okay, let's unpack that, because before we even get to the legal side, what was the trigger? The source jumps straight to expansionism. What exactly was said that made this editorial shift from seeing it as maybe political grandstanding to something requiring global legal condemnation?
Well, the source points to specific statements from high-level Ethiopian officials, including the prime minister, arguing that being landlocked isn't sustainable, and crucially claiming Ethiopia has a natural and historical right to sea access.
Okay, on the surface, needing access sounds economic, right? But the source focuses on that historical right language.
Exactly. The editorial argues that invoking a historical right to territory that's currently part of another sovereign nation, that's the key marker. That's what they say signifies aggressive intent, not just economic need.
I wonder, though, could this just be maybe poorly chosen words, like language aimed more at a domestic audience, not necessarily a concrete plan for invasion right now? Is the source maybe taking the most extreme reading?
The source really pushes back on that idea. It argues that in diplomacy, what leaders say publicly matters. It creates intent. And crucially, the analysis insists this rhetoric directly violates core international agreements.
Which ones?
But the Constitutive Act of the African Union and the UN Charter. The source says when you start talking about changing borders based on historical claims or desire, you've legally crossed the line.
And that's what moves it out of just politics and into international law for them.
Okay.
And the source is quite forceful about the AU and UN needing to act.
Very. It argues that silence from these bodies makes them, and this is their word, complicit in undermining the very legal norms that were meant to keep Africa stable after colonialism.
So failure to speak out is seen as actively damaging the system they're supposed to protect.
That's the argument, yes. If the treaties say uphold sovereignty, then ignoring open challenges to that sovereignty erodes the whole structure.
Okay, let's get into that legal structure. You mentioned the African Union context. What's the core legal principle the source is worried about?
Right. To really get the source's perspective, we need to understand this foundational principle, uti possidetis juris. It sounds complicated, but is basically the bedrock of post-colonial Africa.
Explain that for us. What does it mean in practice?
It means that the borders drawn by colonial powers, however arbitrary they were, became the fixed sovereign borders of the new African states when they gained independence. You inherit the borders you had on day one.
Why stick with those lines, even if they were flawed? Couldn't new nations just redraw them more logically?
Well, think about the alternative. Back in 1963, when the Organization of African Unity, the AU's predecessor, was formed, the continent was a patchwork of lines cutting across ethnic groups, geographies, everything.
Right.
They had a stark choice. Accept those existing, albeit imperfect, lines, or try to renegotiate every single border in Africa based on ethnicity or history.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. It would have meant instant continent-wide conflict. So they chose uti possidetis juris, stability over perfect borders. It became the rule. You don't change the lines.
So the source sees this principle not just as law, but as essential for peace, non-negotiable. And what's the specific way they claim Ethiopia is trying to get around this fundamental agreement?
The source says it's by bringing in arguments like historical right or economic necessity to justify demanding border changes, or at least access that infringes on sovereignty.
Ah, okay.
Seeking to expand influence or territory using those kinds of justifications, the source argues, is a direct attack on Uripasideta's juris. It's using words to undermine the legal foundation.
And connecting that to the bigger picture. The source warns this isn't just about Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's a threat to the whole continent, especially the Horn of Africa, which is already, well, fragile.
That's the core fear. If one major country can successfully argue its way out of its established borders based on current needs or historical claims, it potentially opens the door for every other border dispute across Africa to reignite.
It sends a signal that maybe those post-independence treaties aren't so solid after all.
Precisely. And the source argues that directly threatens the security of millions.
Okay, that clarifies why the AU is such a focus here. But you also mentioned the UN. If the AU deals with the African context, how does the UN Charter fit in? What's the global angle?
The UN comes in because the source sees this as potentially violating the global prohibition on force. The editorial specifically points to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter.
Right, remind us what that says.
It explicitly forbids any member state from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So this isn't just about African rules. It invokes the fundamental global rule against aggression.
And the source warns about the consequences if the UN doesn't act.
Yes, huge diplomatic implications, according to the analysis. Treating these kinds of statements, these threats, as just rhetoric, could set a really dangerous precedent. Not just for Africa, but globally.
So it's about the credibility of the whole system designed to prevent wars based on territorial grabs.
That's the so what for everyone. If a major regional power like Ethiopia seems to get away with challenging borders, even rhetorically at first, it might encourage other states around the world who have similar ideas.
It weakens the deterrent effect of international law.
Exactly. The source warns that silence essentially risks giving a green light to those who think borders can be redrawn by force or coercion.
Let's shift then to Eritrea's perspective, as presented in the source. How does the editorial define Eritrea's sovereignty, and why is it framed as this inviolable red line?
The source uses very strong language here. It talks about Eritrea's independence being won through immense sacrifice, after one of Africa's longest liberation wars.
Okay.
The analysis describes Eritrea's integrity as non-negotiable, something maintained by unshakable unity. The point being made is that its sovereignty isn't just a line on a map. It's a deeply rooted historical reality, earned at great cost.
So it's positioning any challenge not just as a legal violation, but as an affront to that history and sacrifice.
Precisely. It implies that dismissing or threatening this hard-won sovereignty for a neighbor's strategic convenience is fundamentally unacceptable.
And from a defense perspective, if Eritrea perceives a real threat based on this rhetoric, what does international law say about their right to respond?
The analysis brings this up directly. It cites Article 51 of the UN Charter.
Article 51, that's the self-defense clause.
That's the one. It recognizes the inherent right of states to individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs. The source uses this legal point to issue a pretty stark warning.
Which is?
That any attempt to actually undermine Eritrea, given its history of resilience and its clear legal right to defend itself under Article 51, would be a grave strategic miscalculation. It suggests such action could ignite wider conflict.
So the message is, Eritrea has the legal right, and likely the will, to defend its borders forcefully.
That's the clear implication from the source, yes.
Okay, let's try to pull this together. What's the source's ultimate conclusion? What's the call to action for the international community, for you listening?
Well, the analysis is really clear that peace won't come from, negotiating away territory under pressure. It argues the path forward requires principled diplomacy, legal consistency, and collective condemnation. Meaning, the world can't just pick and choose which border rules matter. The international community, it argues, must reject these kinds of expansionist claims and firmly uphold the idea that sovereign borders are sacred. Tolerating this rhetoric, they say, endangers not just Eritrea, but the stability of Africa.
So, no room for interpretation in their view. The source flatly states that Ethiopia's actions and words meet the clear criteria of aggressive intent under international law.
Yes. It demands a formal response, basically saying the time for watching and waiting for ambiguity is over.
And the final word from the source.
It concludes that it's now incumbent upon all responsible states, along with regional and global bodies, essentially everyone invested in peace, to, and I quote again, name the aggressor, reject the aggression, and preserve the peace.
They see this as a critical test case.
Very much so. A test of whether those post-WWII global rules and the foundational principles of the OAU-AU still actually mean anything in practice.
Which leaves us with a really challenging thought to end on, building on this source. If this analysis holds water, if African stability really does depend so heavily on rigidly sticking to iudi possidetis juris, what happens when the country perceived as challenging that principle is a major regional power, like Ethiopia, a country often seen as, important for regional stability itself? Does the need for, say, political expediency or maintaining cooperation with a large nation put immense pressure on bodies like the AU or UN not to issue the kind of strong condemnation this editorial demands? And if they stay silent or equivocate, what kind of long-term damage might that do to the whole idea of a rules-based order in Africa and maybe beyond?
That's the dilemma, isn't it? The tension between upholding legal principle and navigating complex geopolitical realities.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot.
Indeed. Well, thank you for walking us through this very intense analysis.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the legal and diplomatic situation unfolding in the Horn of Africa.
Always important to understand the frameworks, even when they're under pressure. Thanks for listening.